Feudalism is the term applied to the primary social system in medieval Europe between the 9th and 15th centuries. Most countries had their own versions of feudal systems during this time, and they worked in a similar way. Feudalism revolved around the concept of lords and vassals. Basically, each country had a monarch, usually a king. This king owned all the land in that country. However, because transportation was much slower in that time than it is today, the king needed a way to exert his authority over the entire kingdom. This is where the nobility came in. The king would divide up his land into several parts, called fiefdoms or fiefs, while keeping some land as his own royal domain. Each fiefdom was ruled by a noble, usually a baron, who would have authority over their respective fiefdom. In this relationship, the king would be the overlord, while the nobles would be the king's vassals. In return for being granted their land, the nobles would swear allegiance to the king and agree to provide the king with military service. Fiefs were hereditary, which means the eldest son of one of the king's barons would inherit the title and its fiefdom. Each of these nobles, in turn, would grant portions of their land to knights. Knights were the warriors of the Middle Ages, and in return for the land they received, they would be required to fight on behalf of their lord when called upon. Knights could also be granted land directly by the king within his royal domain. The land that a knight held was called a knight's fee. One knight's fee was equal to the amount of land a knight would need to support himself and keep his social status. It usually included several thousand acres of land, as well as a manor house where the knight lived when he wasn't in the service of his lord. A knight's fee usually had a town inside it, called a manor. The people who lived and worked in manors were called peasants, and the knight was called the lord of the manor. Peasants could be either free peasants or serfs. Free peasants were people who had most of their rights. Serfs, on the other hand, were bound to a single manor, and were required to work for the knight that owned that manor. Serfs could not leave a manor without the permission of the lord, and they also couldn't marry without their lord's permission. The knight or lord of the manor could also act as a judge within his manor, and impose fines or penalties on the residents. Serfs were tied to the land they belonged to, so if a manor was granted by a noble or the king to some other knight, the serfs would have to work for that knight. Both serfs and free peasants paid rent or a portion of the crops they grew to the lord of their manor, although serfs had to pay much more. The feudal system was very decentralized, because each noble basically had his own army of knights that rivaled that of the king. This often led to a situation where the king had less power than his nobles, and even led to wars between the king and his lords. As time progressed, the armies of countries started to become more centralized, and kings began to rely on mercenaries and professional soldiers more than knights. Eventually, this led to the decline of the feudal system, as lords started to lose their independent power. Most aspects of European feudalism finally came to an end in the 15th century, although some small remnants made it into the 1800s. Today, historians consider the feudal system to be one of the most important parts of the Middle Ages in Europe.